Hello, we are recording for the fabulous Witold Pilecki International Book Award, and today I've got with me Carmela Fonbuena, who's a journalist based in Manila in the Philippines, and she's been educated in the UK, but she's also one of our finalists for the Witold Pilecki International Book Award in the category of the Special Prize for War Correspondence for her book Marawi Siege, Stories from the Front Lines. Welcome, Carmela.
Hi, Alina. Thank you for having me.
Do you know what? Let's dive straight into this because your book is very interesting, because we're going to have to talk a little bit about why in a minute, because obviously we're very Europe centric and we need to know a little bit more about what's going on in the world. But first of all, what inspired you to write this book?
Okay. The Marawi Siege was the biggest operation of the Philippine military in recent history. I got a lot of encouragement to write the book because I spend a lot of time in Marawi during the siege, and I was one of the first journalists to arrive there when the battles erupted on May 23, in May 23, 2017, and I was in and out throughout the five months the battles lasted. I stayed there for weeks to a month each visit. After the siege, I was able to access information that were not available to us when the battles were still raging. Obviously, because the main actors, particularly the military, were busy fighting and were not accessible to us at the time. I also continued to learn more from Marawi residents, local officials, and peace workers that I kept in touch with after the siege. So these conversations provided me with better understanding of events that happened before, during, and even after the siege. It was really all this new information that got me to commit to a book project, because their stories had to be told. And also because my main takeaway from all of this new information I learned was how it underscored how the Marawi Siege was yet again another conflict in Mindanao that was a result of the many issues that has pestered the region for decades. And yes, there's a new international jihadist group involved, which was the Islamic State, that was so effective in propagating its ideology. But if you look closely, the reason Islamic State successfully recruited local people was because it took advantage of the local people's deep-seated grievances against the government, against the backdrop of widespread poverty, criminality, and corruption in government. The Islamic State presented itself as the better alternative. So I think it was important to understand the big picture, and that's what I hope the book would help people achieve.
So what is actually new in this book and what makes it so unique?
There are several books, great books written on the siege already, focusing on military operations or the experiences of the residents or the status of the rehabilitation of the former battle area. I suppose the book is unique because it attempted to bring together as many voices and perspectives about the Marawi Siege in one book. And I wrote it from their perspectives. I tried not to cast judgment on the people I interviewed. I just presented it the way they saw the siege. This is important because Marawi Siege to this day continues to be a very divisive issue, and conclusions are very different based on who is telling the story. If you ask the military, it was a successful military operation because they defeated the militants. They've been very proud of their battle victories. If you ask many residents, however, they would tell you how they think the airstrikes during the siege were excessive, and they blamed these airstrikes for the destruction of their homes. So the book is a presentation of narratives of the ground troops, commanding generals, residents, local officials, and officials of the national government. Also, I think equally important, because sometimes its role is not always mentioned, is the rebel group Moro Islamic Liberation Front. It was clear to me and to peace workers that the Marawi Siege was meant to sabotage the peace process between the government and the MILF. And the siege was really a battle of legitimacy between, on one hand, the MILF, which offered the people a better future by talking peace with the government, and on the other, the Islamic State, which wanted the people to separate from the government and choose to live under its rule. This discussion continues to be important today because the government and the MILF signed a peace agreement after the siege. And the MILF now leads a new autonomous government in Mindanao, which is called the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region in Mindanao, or BARM. Now that MILF is in power, the challenge for them, they now have the obligation to fulfill their promises of peace and development. And if they're not able to fulfill their promises, if poverty and corruption and criminality continues, the cycle of conflict will just continue. So that's really what's at stake.
So working on this book, has it inspired a range of new topics that have not really been researched or written about before?
There's rich literature on Mindanao's conflicts, and the lessons from the Marawi Siege were really not new. But the challenge has always been the inclination towards military-centric solution, which does not address the root causes of conflicts. These military-centric solutions perpetuate the cycle of conflict and violence, and that's what I hope the book would help achieve. It was to join the call to address the root causes of conflict and to emphasize that really there are no shortcuts to this. It's the same realization each time a conflict happens. And again, it's important because unfortunately, the government, even after the Marawi Siege, continues to resort to this, short-sighted military solutions to the country's problems. And it's a really big issue for us because last year, in the middle of the pandemic, Philippine Congress passed an anti-terrorism act, which we believe is prone to abuse and misuse, and it threatens human rights, including freedom of the press. So I think these kinds of solutions are not helpful because clearly the law does not have the support of the public.
Do you know what? We're quite so Eurocentric here. We're obsessed. We know what's happening in Europe. Sometimes we know what's happening in America. Occasionally we talk about the Middle East, but the Philippines, we don't get very much information about what's happening out there. So let's talk about a little bit about this because we need to know more. First of all, what is the Marawi Siege? What happened during this siege? And you did mention you were there, but where were you in sort of like in a house, in a hut, hiding out in the forest? Where were you at the time? What were you doing?
So what happened on May 23, 2017? It's an important context to understand that the Philippines is predominantly Catholic, but in Marawi City, up to 99% of its residents are Muslims. So it's called the Islamic City of Marawi. So on May 23, 2017, sympathizers of the Islamic State, so this would be local fighters and foreign fighters, laid siege on Marawi City in the hope to establish a wilayat, or a province of the Islamic State. And like many battles around the world, the siege erupted because there was a failure to appreciate intelligence information. The militants slowly but surely brought in their forces inside Marawi City. I was covering the security sector as a journalist, and when battles erupted in Marawi City, I heard it in the radio actually, and I immediately contacted some commanders on the ground to ask what it was about. Around 3 p.m., probably 4 p.m. on that day, I was being told that there was an operation against a valuable target, and that I wasn't told immediately that it was Isnilon Hapilon, who was the leader of the Islamic State inspired group in the Philippines. But there was some sort of excitement that the military was going to get a high value target. Just a few hours later, we would all realize that it was bigger than anything we've seen on the ground. And even my sources, the commanders, they changed tune immediately before nighttime on May 23, 2017 to say that, the conflict has escalated and that they weren't expecting the reactions on the ground. And that night, Marawi burned, government buildings, the church were burned by the militant groups. And as you know, the rest is history. It became a 5-month long siege. But Marawi Siege had had dire international implications. Yes, it was a continuation of local conflicts, but because of the involvement of the Islamic State, there were dire international implications. If you remember, the year 2017 was the time Islamic State was beginning to lose territories in Iraq and Syria, and the Caliphate, I remember, lost Mosul to Iraqi security forces in July 2017. So the Philippine military was aware of this context, and it knew it could not allow for any perception that the militants were winning the war in Marawi, because, such news could invite Islamic State fighters to travel to the Philippines. That was the fear. So if there was going to be a province in the Philippines, it would become a destination for the militants. And remember, at the time, the borders were strict already. There's a lot of fighters who could not enter Syria or Iraq. And the fear was that they will be diverted to the Philippines. And it did happen to a certain extent. Even after the siege, we were all surprised by the suicide bombing by an Indonesian couple of a Catholic church in Sulu, another province in Mindanao, about a year after the siege. And based on intelligence reports, they were actually hoping to travel to the Middle East, but they were caught and were deported. So their next destination would be the Philippines. So it's all connected that way.
I find this so interesting because, as I mentioned previously, we talk about the Middle East and we talk about Europe and America, 9/11 and the London bombings and what happened in Germany and France and everything else. But in all honesty, I'm going to be honest with you here. I did not know that any of this was happening in the Philippines at all. Philippines just doesn't seem to be on the radar of Western media at all.
I think because there's just so many things that were happening around the globe too. And when you talk about the Islamic State, in fact, in the beginning, it was being belittled, the threat. And I think that led to the failure to appreciate intelligence information. There were a lot of debates whether it was really the Islamic State influencing the local militant groups here, or whether we're making so big a deal out of it. Obviously, there were a lot of local groups that wanted to be associated, local militant groups that wanted to be associated with the Islamic State because it was growing to be a big power in the Middle East. And obviously, we didn't expect that it would collapse a few years later. But at the time, there were really a lot of local militant groups, again, because they had deep-seated grievances against the government. They wanted change, and they did feel, obviously falsely, that the Islamic State would be a good alternative for them.
I do want to touch, before we move on to some of the other questions, because they're quite interesting questions, I want to know, how did you survive during the siege? I mean, what were you doing? Where were you? Where were you living? Were you having to move from place to place? What was your living situation like?
So like most of the conflicts we covered in the region, in that area of Mindanao, we would be based in Iligan City. That's an hour's drive from Marawi City, because we would have more access to hotels. It was easier to get to the airport from there, and we would just travel daily to Marawi City. Obviously, when I arrived in the area on the second day of the siege, but I arrived there in the afternoon. And when I went to the border, I would see the exodus of cars, apparently a lot of them from Marawi City, trying to escape the battles. So, you had to make a lot of decisions. So do you go in now or later? Because obviously at the beginning, we didn't really know what was happening yet. So I didn't risk going to Marawi yet. I just stayed at the border and talking to people from Marawi City. We went to Marawi City the following day. I think one of the challenges really was the daily travel from Iligan to Marawi City in the early days of the Marawi Siege, because you don't really know what to expect there. So when we traveled the first time to Marawi City, we would see a plume of smoke in the distance. Obviously, we would hear the bullets. It's scary. But the first thing I did was to go to the military camp. I wanted to be sure we were safe, in the sense that we would understand where the front lines were, where where we could go, where it's safe to go, where it's not. So obviously we don't want to be just barging into areas where we don't know the militants might be occupying. But when I arrived there, everything was just in this array. And even the military obviously was shocked by the responses of the militant groups. And I didn't really realize then that there were no front lines yet. In fact, when we were inside the military camp was harassed because apparently we would learn later it was one of the first targets of the militant groups. And it was really scary. I mean, I don't claim to be so courageous, that I'd barge into battle. We tried to stay safe as possible, and that we tried to communicate with commanders on the ground, where we could go, what we could do. So that those were the safety nets we had during the siege. You make decisions every day. There was a time we decided to not go to Marawi, stay in Iligan for a particular day because we go there every day. There were days when we decided to stay in Iligan just to see what's going on, because there was a time when even media vehicles were victimized by stray bullets. And in fact, an Australian journalist was hit on the neck and was hospitalized. So there were those real dangers. So there was a time we decided to, hey, let's see what's going on. Why there's so many stray bullets in what was supposed to be a safe area in Marawi City. So, but then we couldn't just stay in Iligan for so long. I think there was a time when obviously we wore flak vests when we're in Marawi, and there was a time we relaxed a little bit. It felt that where we were, where we gathered information for our stories, seemed safe, far from the front lines of battles. But then when the stray bullets became a problem, we had to wear our flak jackets again because we really don't know, we can't guarantee our safety.
That's just, I can't imagine. I mean, you say you're not courageous. I think every journalist would say that to a point, but being a war correspondent, you're literally going into that front line and you're at risk from, like you said, a stray bullet. Why are there stray bullets in a safety zone? And the Australian journalist got hit. I mean, it's incredible in itself. Us staying safely in Europe, in our safe homes, and you out on the front lines. But I want to talk about, because this is something we ought to always talk about when it comes down to things like current conflict and things, for example, what's going on in the Middle East and Africa. I mean, wherever really at the end of the day, is misinformation, because you must have come across some sort of misinformation and propaganda. I mean, how did you get around all of this complete and utter chaos?
Misinformation was a real challenge from day one. It could be big, it could be small, but it affects your operations. It affects the way you make your decisions. And we really had to make sure that we didn't aid in the propagation of disinformation, because there was a lot of it. And we also had to make sure that it did not affect the logistics of our coverage. I told you when we flew to Mindanao, we were based in Iligan City, right? And on day one, it circulated on Facebook that Iligan was going to close its borders. So no one can go out, no one can go in. Supposedly so that militants from Marawi would not be able to enter the city and attack Iligan City as well. So there's a lot of paranoia that day. So that obviously that's scary, but that's also a huge problem for us because, journalists were based in Iligan. So if Iligan was going to close its borders, did it mean we would not be able to travel to Marawi? And if we had to leave Iligan because they were going to close the borders, where was it safe to transfer? These are things you plan for your safety and for your team, right? So we had to call so many people that night just to verify that information. And there were a lot of problems. It was difficult to get in touch with the local officials, but eventually we were able to, and it turned out that the information was false. So we can stay in Iligan, rely on there's certain way we do things. You're comfortable that where you can stay, and then where you can go, who your driver will be. So, but can you just imagine the travel we had to go through because of that disinformation? And that's just our experience, right? imagine the Marawi residents receiving all of this disinformation during the siege. So how are they going to make their decisions, whether to stay in their homes and wait for the battles to, stop, or to evacuate? How are they going to make these important decisions, which could mean life or death, if they don't have the right information on their hands, right? So that's just the impact of this information. I even spoke to a Marawi resident, for example. He was working in Manila when the siege erupted. He rushed home, tried the best he could to go home to Marawi City, because he received a text message that foreign militaries were going to do airstrikes on Marawi City. So these are the kinds of disinformation that, that propagated during the siege. Obviously, there were worse gossip, allegations against military or particular civilians that went around. And it's a big challenge, because you'd hear the same stories from so many people, and you'd assume it must be true because a lot of people are telling the story. But then the problem is, they could be basing their narrations from Facebook posts they've read. So it was important for us, for example, so it's the same story because they've read the same post. So it was important for us during the crisis to, always ask, where did you get that information? Is it from personal experience? Did you hear it from someone? Where did that person get his information? Could you refer us to that person so we could talk to him more about this incident? So these are the challenges. But it's really important not to make the mistake of propagating this information, because again, it could decide actions of people on the ground.
God,
and, it's really easier to spread. No, I also realized that it's easier to spread disinformation when people are in panic, such as in crisis, when people are emotional and when they're desperate for information. I felt that during the COVID-19 crisis, during the pandemic, even the country capital, who's not, experience conflicts like they do in Mindanao, had been victim of a lot of disinformation. I would see the same reactions to the crisis that I saw in conflicts, because when people are so desperate for information, they're going to listen to anyone who's going to provide it, and if they're not careful, they will make their decisions based on these lies.
I mean,
it's
totally
a tough
agree.
world.
I totally agree with this. I mean, you literally just said brought the COVID pandemic, which brought a sort of idea into my mind that when the COVID pandemic did hit, there was this misinformation flying around my region that they're going to shut off Silesia from the rest of Poland. They're going to lock off the borders. So everyone in Silesia started going into a panic because, people cross the voivodeship borders and work in different cities, and and they're like, oh my God, and there's going to be no food, and there's going to be no water and no toilet paper. And I mean, what happened in Poland wasn't as severe as what happened in England, but still people went out and started panic buying and things, and it was all of this misinformation. And then the president came on and he was like, calm down, we're not shutting off the whole of Poland, please stop panicking. But as you said,
it's really important to correct misinformation quickly.
Exactly,
because
I
that's
agree.
the challenge. And even in Marawi, they were fighting battles in the city center, but they were also fighting battles online, so that disinformation, not just disinformation, but outright propaganda in favor of one or the other, were being waged online. So tough world we're living in, and it's really tough even for journalists. You have to take a pause whenever you hear information. Every day you try to make sense of what's going on around you and where the battles are going. So it was a 5-month-long siege. Before that, in 2013, I covered another urban warfare, which is the Zamboanga siege in another part of Mindanao. That lasted 3 weeks. So it's an urban warfare also. So we didn't really expect it, not even the military. I don't suppose the militants expected the siege to last for 5 months. So can you just imagine how the people were feeling, were thinking? throughout those 5 months, because there was a point it didn't seem like it was going to end.
COVID is no match for something like that at all. So,
but I did feel like the country capital had a taste of some sort of a conflict in that sense.
What's the situation like now in Marawi?
It's been 4 years since the Marawi Siege. Unfortunately, the rehabilitation of the former battle area has not been completed. So this has been a source of disappointment on the part of a lot of people. The government did say they were going to complete rehabilitation December of this year. By the looks of it, it's not going to be completed in December, but they were hoping to finish the main buildings at least by early next year. So before the elections, before the term of President Rodrigo Duterte ends. But again, when the government talks of rehabilitation, they're talking of rebuilding government infrastructure. What's really important is the return of the displaced residents to their homes. And to this day, there have only been a few hundred people who were able to return because of one issue or another. It's a complex problem in the sense that there's a lot of land issues in the area. That and there's also conflicts over land, so it becomes so complex. So it's my heart goes out to everyone. They haven't been able to return, and now there's even a conflict between properties that the government is saying belongs to the government, but people have tax certificates over this land. So these are conflicts that will continue beyond the term of President Rodrigo Duterte, and this could pose a big problem if it's not resolved. Again, we're looking at addressing the root causes of conflict, and these land issues have always been, big issues that result that perpetuate this conflict. So there's still a lot of problems, unfortunately.
Carmela, thank you so much for joining us. That was really enlightening. I really enjoyed this, and do make sure you go and grab yourself a copy of the book. I love the structure. I've just got to throw out that I love the way that the book is structured, a bit of like a diary, which is really interesting. So thank you so much for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
Thank you very much.